Hi, welcome to Lights Camera Author. I'm Jim Juno, and this is the show, the podcast where we talk with authors who write books about Hollywood, movies, television, and music, anything that strikes our fancy. And I have with me tonight a very special guest. His name is Taylor Hagood, and his new book has just come out. It is called Stringbean, and it is the life and murder of a country legend. Welcome, Taylor. Or
Thank you very much.
should I call you Dr. Haygood because you are a teacher, a professor down at Florida Atlantic, correct?
I am, but Taylor will do just fine.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we won't talk about Florida Atlantic in the NCAA tournament this year, okay? So, but
That
string,
really put us on the map, I have to say.
well, I thought String Bean, whose real name was David Aikman. Now, for those of you who are of a certain age, you would remember Stringbean from the show Hee Haw. This guy was really big. He was one of the biggest country music stars around in the early 70s. Well, actually, longer than that, going back to the 60s. And all of a sudden, out of nowheres, tragedy strikes. So let me ask you, what got you interested in this story?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm so honored to be on this podcast. It's just a pleasure to do so, and thank you so much. I'm just honored to do it,
Well,
and
thank
I
you. I
appreciate
appreciate
that.
that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate this question very much. How do you go? How does anybody? It's kind of an interesting question in a way. How does anybody come to the writing, I guess, of somebody else's life? In a way, there. I don't not to get too mystical about it, but I think one of the things I think anybody who writes a biography, kind of, I think at some point you have a question about how is it that I became the person who wrote this story? That what are there factors or forces that are beyond, I don't know, something I'm conscious of. But what I am conscious of, I guess I will say, is that when I was a kid, I always loved old country music. I love Jimmy Rogers and Hank Williams and Patsy Cline, all those singers. And I was really fascinated with country music. And when I was about 12 years old, I was looking at a book on the history of country music, and I ran across a picture of String Bean. And of course, he has a very unusual anatomy. And in case to give a picture of that for anybody who's listening, uh, the he had a very long torso and very short legs, or at least
Yes,
that's what it looked like.
that
So
was
he
the
had a
costume. Yes.
that was the costume. So he had a very long shirt, and later on, he actually got his pants from Little Jimmy Dickens. So they were the little short jeans were connected to the long shirt, and String Bean was probably about 6'3", 6'5". There's some differing reckonings of that, but anyway, I saw a picture of him in this book, and I thought, "Wow, who is this guy?"
Mhm.
So what is this all about? And not too long after that, my parents, I kind of, I guess, talked them into taking me to the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville and Tennessee. And there I saw his banjo. And I had already been really interested in the banjo, and they had bought me one from Sears catalog. And but when I saw his in the Country Music Hall of Fame, I thought, wow, this is really an instrument that's totally different from anything I've seen before. And I heard them, and I realized it was this guy. And my parents were talking in the background, and I heard them mentioning about his being murdered. And so then years later, I kind of went off and did, was growing up and so forth. And then later on, about 7 years ago, I his a picture of him just popped up on the phone, a video of Stream Bean, and I thought, I would like to read a book about him. And there really wasn't one. There was one that had been written in 1975. It was not a biography. It was just a story of the investigation of the his after his murder. Didn't really have that much about his life or even the trial that followed, but it had been written and published private, in a small run by a reporter, basically in Nashville in 1975. But there really wasn't a biography. And when there wasn't one, I thought, well, I guess I'll be the person who writes it.
There you go. Yeah, and now I'm going to ask you. I've noticed your accent, and It's a little bit like mine. You're from Tennessee originally?
I was born in North Mississippi,
North Mississippi. Okay.
but it's at the Tennessee line.
Okay. I'm from Kentucky originally, so I hear
Ah,
so you may hear me say y'all, so that's okay.
what part of Kentucky, if I may ask?
Louisville.
Ah, okay.
And it's pronounced Louisville. Don't go Louisville or whatever. But
Well, I appreciate that.
no problem. But the now, but Stringbean, you mentioned his murder. This was some Nash for people who aren't aware of this. This had as big of an effect on the Nashville area as I would say the Manson murders had in Los Angeles, because Nashville was a small, close knit, especially the country music people. They were a close knit family,
Mhm.
and afterwards, all the security systems came into play.
Yes, sir, absolutely. And of course, Stream Bean, by the way, was from the eastern part of Kentucky. He was from Jackson County originally. But you're right. The Really, it was probably the most sensational case, the murder, most devastating murder probably in the entire 20th century in Nashville. And you're right. Before that time, the country music artists were really pretty accessible. You had these famous hangouts, in Nashville. Tootsie's was probably the most
Oh
famous
yeah.
one, but a lot of people could go. There was a lot of access to the country music stars, and there was this close knit kind of family feel. I think about especially in the industry, but even Nashville. I think it didn't think of itself as a big city prior to this time. But you're right; these murders somehow it just it burst the bubble, and suddenly it felt like this was a big city with big city problems. And you're right; the many of the country stars, whether it was Buck Owens or Porter Wagner, and some of these really big stars, they started setting up security systems. The walls went up around the houses, and I think in general, I think there was a lot of fear, and about right in the middle of the murder investigations, this has been sort of lost in the shuffle sometimes, but right in the middle of that investigation, there was another murder committed in Nashville. Hank Snow's guitarist was a guy named James Widner or Widener. He was murdered, and there was a lot of concern when it happened. This was maybe a month later after the murders of David and Estelle Aikman Stringbean. There was a lot of concern that maybe there was a serial killer who was just out after country music stars, but it turned out not to be connected. But that was a real concern, and it just really ratcheted up the fear and concern at that time, going into 1974. And it was an interesting time anyway. As part of the research for this, I basically read every issue of the Nashville, Tennessean newspaper from November the 11th, 1973 until about November 14th or something, 1974. I didn't read every word, but
Hmm.
I wanted to immerse myself in that moment. And it was a very interesting moment. It was a time when Metro, which was a fairly new organization for the police force and the city government, it was really a countywide thing. That was a new kind of newish development, and there were issues, drug issues, and so forth in the area. And then going through 1974, you know, articles about String Bean would be on the front page with articles about Watergate. So it was a really interesting moment.
And it also, I mean, from reading your book, I had not realized this, but the Metro Police Force was not a big force. Well, first off, when the bodies were discovered by his best friend, also a country music star named Grandpa Jones, um, he called the Nashville Police, I believe, and
Yes, sir.
then
The State Highway Patrol came out first, but yes,
yeah, and they weren't it wasn't in their jurisdiction. They
correct.
contacted Metro,
Right.
and what surprised me was that the Metro Police did not have a big murder unit or homicide unit.
No, sir. They really did not. That was not very well developed. They actually had to make their own kits, their own investigation kits. Those were not provided. It was very low tech kind of a situation. Just to clarify, Metro includes Nashville. The turf problem became because Ridgetop, Tennessee, where the murders were committed, was right on the county line, um, of Davidson County and Robertson County. So that was kind of where the problem came in. But yes, that's very small, really very small kind of force had to cover a huge area, the whole county, Davidson County. So it was a really a problem, for that.
Right. And as you say in your book, I mean, they did not have a huge force, especially for a double murder. Uh,
Right.
as heinous as this murder was, I'm going to give away some background here on the murder. On that night, the killers who were in they, this is how I guess you want to say friendly the Nashville area was. There was no security system at all in Stringbean's house. All you had to do was drive up a gravel driveway, up to the house, knock on the door, and Stringbean would answer. Um, I don't know how often that happened, but that night, these two guys drove up, broke in the door, looked for money, thinking they were going to find a bunch of money in there, and they don't find anything. Uh, him and his wife, Aikman and his wife, come home. He has a gun on him. He comes in. Does he shoot at them and miss? Is that what the theory is? Is that
That's the theory. Yeah, it's trying to go through that murder night is pretty tough. You're right. There was not really a security system. There was one of Stream Bean's country music fellow country music figures, Grand Ole Opry stars, was saying they did say in a police report claim that there was a piece of string
a
put
string?
up on
Yeah.
the cattle gate, ironically string bean, but but that was never really necessarily established officially in the police records. But that may have been a giveaway for string bean. The official kind of story is, yeah, that string bean came in shooting. He did carry a 22 revolver, and he was known for that. And the story is that he came in shooting, and that may have happened. It's a little bit unclear. One of the things I found really digging into the story is that the standard story is that String Bean came home on that Saturday night, November the 10th, 1973, from the Grand Ole Opry, he and his wife. And they drove a Cadillac. Basically, they would buy a Cadillac every year, a new one, and just record. They would trade in and just record write down the mileage at the end of the year for tax purposes. That was their thing. But anyway, they pulled up there, and that String Bean knew somehow that there was somebody in there, and he came in shooting. And then the shootout happened, and the murderers happened to kill Estelle and David Aikman.
Estelle's murder was especially heinous because
Yes,
she ran for her life. They shot
yes.
her, and as she's laying on the ground begging for her life, the killers shoot her in the head.
Uh,
And
uh, Absolutely, and it's execution style, point blank in the head, and that part is unquestionable. And String Bean was shot only once, right through the heart, and but that's exactly right. Yes, and she was out in the yard, and it was very very difficult as far as kind of the actual details. What I found was that they're not quite as clear cut as they seem. A lot of the details were based on one of the murderers named Doug Brown. In when he was in jail awaiting the trial, his lawyer was a guy named Joe Binkley. He was by the way, the lawyers are very interesting characters.
yeah,
They're like something out of a John Grissom novel.
yeah, I mean
They're
that story's in
crazy.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the guy who represented Doug Brown was the highest paid lawyer and defense attorney in the entire city of Nashville. His name was Joseph Binkley or Joe Binkley, and he had this sort of trick he would do where he would get a confession basically from someone, and he would get that put in the newspaper, and that was his way of getting the the defendant's voice into the courtroom later without the defendant actually taking the stand. Now, that is really what most of the case was based on. The story he told was, as you say, that Stringbean and surprised him and his cousin, whose name was John Brown, and Stringbean came in shooting. They had a shootout, and according to Doug, it was John who did the shooting and killing. So he was trying to frame his cousin. It's not a laughing matter, but that story is told a certain way. That's not exactly the way the story was told when he called the Nashville Tennessean only a few days after the murder. He claimed at that time that his partner had killed Stringbean with Stringbean's own gun, which the story kind of changed later on without giving too much away. But that was kind of what the case was built on, and it was a kind of an interesting thing that the case was argued based on one killer trying to frame the other one in a newspaper article. So trying to nail down the details, it turns out there was another cousin actually, and there are rumors that that cousin may have been present. So it's when you get into the details, I guess what I found was that maybe what a lot of people know is that murder is never simple. It's
Uh,
always messy.
and what really surprised you after doing all the research? What kind of caught your eye or caught you off guard?
I think probably the fact that probably the fact that the standard story that people have known for decades. Because let me tell you, as I'm sure you know, a lot of people know the story of String Bean. I have been talk about surprised. I've been actually very surprised, just being really across the country. I can mention String Bean's name, and people know. Yep, he was murdered. He had money in the house, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, I did have one of the things to say about the money in the house, but that story is very well known, and it's known a certain way. But that standard story, what I found was that one of the defense attorneys, the one who represented John Brown, had a totally different idea about what happened that night, and I understand that's his job. I do,
Mhm.
but it's when you really look at the case, he was really poking a lot of holes in the case of the state, and it kind of looks, it starts to look a little bit different because one of the cousins was invested in the country music industry in certain ways, and it all looks a little bit closer together when you look at it. But I want to say one other thing about the money. A lot of the argument is that those murders were committed with money as the motivation. David and Estelle Ekman had come of age during the Great Depression. They didn't trust banks, and they did carry cash around. That's absolutely the truth. But there was a big wad of $3,000 on Stringbean's body the morning after the murders, and 2,000 on her pinned to her bra. Meanwhile, the question of where money was, a lot of people claim that there was money in food cans in the freezer. The current owner, actually, of Stringbean's house, turns out there's a cave on the property, and this is a well-known fact. But there are a lot of places in that cave. There's been some speculation along those lines that maybe there was money there, but none of that money was ever discovered. So you kind of wonder, where did that go? Now, part of the Stringbean lore is that decades later, and then a couple of decades later, that the owner at the house at the time uh, found a loose brick in the fireplace, and
Mhm.
that there was money gnawed, maybe as much as $20,000 that had been gnawed by rats. That may be a true story. There was one of the investigators in the case had come out and verified the story, but there's also, if you kind of talk around with people, there's also some doubt about that. And one of the things that's been pointed out is that fireplace, by people who, again, by people who are very connected with the house, will say it that way, that fireplace gets very hot. The idea that that money could have lasted that long, and so forth, is kind of maybe a little bit suspect. So I guess maybe one of the things, as far as I guess I have several things that were a surprise. One of those was that with just about every aspect of Stringbean's life, there are about 3 or 4 different versions of it, and there are people who argue things even down to the date of his birth. There's a family Bible that has his date recorded one year. Then there are other years. I finally was able to get the official birth certificate from the state of Kentucky that would seem to settle it, but I'll tell you, Jim, just about every turn, um, everything from whether or not Stringbean was playing baseball originally with Bill Monroe to any number of things. There are just all these different stories. It's very, very hard to know for certain what the truth is about a lot of things about his life.
Was the biggest insult I thought of the whole thing was that, okay, during that time, Tennessee did not have capital punishment. I think it,
Uh,
I think it was yeah, you know where I'm going. It was reinstated in 2000, but when the murders occur, they didn't have a death penalty. And although one of the cousins died in prison,
yes, sir.
the other one was paroled. I'm sorry. I mean, this was a monster who killed two people in cold blood, one execution style. And
Yeah.
I mean, he gave the old "I found Jesus in prison," and I'm like, okay, he can keep you company in your cell, But when you found that out, what was your thoughts?
Well, yes. So this is the thing, right? No matter what the details, whatever the sort of details are, it's definitely the case that both of the people who ultimately were convicted. Again, don't want to give too much away about the story, but this is fairly well known. Both of the people who were convicted were absolutely at the scene of the crime. Whatever roles they played, they were in it, and it's absolutely true. And it was a brutal murder, and they were very nasty people. They just were. And in fact, in the process of writing the book, I'll tell you, probably the most difficult thing about writing the book was trying to put all these stories together, because Stringbean's life story, the biography, in most biographies end when somebody dies, but this one's just getting going. And in some ways, it's hard to both sides of the story take meaning from each other, and but trying to keep that all going was a real challenge. But one of the things that really hit me was it was such a joy, really, to write about Stringbean's life, and it was so painful to write about the murder, and especially when the Browns, John and Doug Brown, came into it, and Roy and Charlie and the rest of them, all the Browns who were involved in it. Four of them were originally arrested. They are just so ugly. They were into all kind of criminal activity. They were just it just makes you feel bad, they were just bad. They were just evil. And really the contrast between how evil they were and how really innocent String Bean was in Estelle. I mean, it's the contrast. It's like a great tragedy, and it's terrible. And everybody was outraged, and they were terrible. Now you're right. Over the course of decades, there was a church in Nashville called Cornerstone Church, and the minister of that actually was in prison for murder in his 20s. And then when he became minister of this place, he started hiring ex-convicts and so forth. And he was one of the lead people, and other people who said, well, this John Brown, the one who was alive, he's had a change. He's found, as you say, he's found Jesus, and he's become different. Now, his wife, by the way, was the accountant at the Cornerstone Church. But that was the argument. And I guess for myself, I don't want to I can't speak personally about someone's conscience,
Mm-hmm.
so I wouldn't want to do
True.
that. But I will say this. I'll say this. This is not myself talking. This is just talking about how the city saw it. It was very interesting that, you got to 2014 when you had all these parole hearings. There would be these friends of Stringbean and Estelle, people like Whispering Bill Anderson, Porter Wagner, Gene Shepard, opera stars, and they would say Mac Wiseman, and they were very vocal. They said, this was too awful, and it just the punishment has to be served. But what happened over the course of time is that Nashville changed. A lot of people moved into Nashville. It's changed tremendously since, say, the 1980s, mid 1990s. It's a totally different place now. A lot of people moved from not only out of Nashville, but out of the South, not even in the South, not in the state. And a whole different way of thinking arose. And really, the story of John Brown became one of redemption in people, in a lot of the media presentation. The media also presented the other side of it. But really, the city ended up divided all over again by 2014, when the parole took place. There were people who felt that this was a great triumph of rehabilitation. but there were a lot of people in Nashville that felt the pain all over again.
Is he still alive?
Mr.
John
Brown
Brown?
is still alive. John Brown, yes. Now, Doug Brown died in the same prison that the fictional Hannibal Lecter was on his way to being put into in Tennessee. But John Brown is still alive. He's paroled, and and
Do,
I've heard. Listen, I tried to speak with him. I wanted to try to get his side of the story, and I wasn't able to do that. I didn't succeed in doing that. Um, I have met people who claim to know him and say that it really is true that he's had a change. But so again, it's not my place to speak to someone's conscience, but it's
mhm.
I can say that it was something that I think there are a lot of people in Nashville that are still feel very bad about that.
I will. I think he ought to be in jail. But hey, that's
Yeah, yeah, right.
that's
There are
just
a lot
me.
of people who are there.
Yeah, because like I mentioned earlier, I remember when this happened, and because my parents were big country music fans,
Mhm.
Hank Williams, I
Yeah.
mean old country music fans, Porter Wagner. That's every Saturday we had to watch Porter Wagner show. Okay, but and we watched Hee Haw,
Yeah.
and it was like it was like a death in the family.
Right.
When that happened, and people now, I would say it would be comparable to, well, I don't want to wish let's say somebody big in country music nowadays,
Hmm.
uh, it would be earth shaking, even more so now with the internet and everything like that. I compare it to maybe when Michael Jackson died, or when
Yeah.
um or when Elvis Presley died. They weren't murdered, of course, but it was a sudden ripping of the cultural fabric of America.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially because really Stringbean, this was somebody who had no enemies. This was somebody who went through a Great Depression, World War, atomic bomb. He went through Korean War, Cold War, Vietnam, all this incredible turmoil right in the middle of the 20th century, all these times, and all he did was make people happy.
Yeah.
He played a banjo. He was a singer. He was a comic. From Hee Haw, he had that thing he did, the letters from home, and he would say, "I've got this letter right here next to my heart, heart, heart." Yeah, he would. Yeah, right, exactly. He would reach all around his body looking for it, and he was somebody who, despite all kinds of trouble and all kinds of change and challenges, he was somebody who you could tune in, as you say, on a Saturday night, whether it was a Porter Widener show or Hee Haw or the Grand Ole Opry, and he made you feel good. He made you feel good,
Yeah.
and that was what he really brought to the table. And I think especially, and that's what singers do. You think of any of the great country singers or any genre, they make you feel good. But I think especially String Bean, he was a gentle person. He was, he had this outrageous costume, but in fact, he was very understated, very quiet, uh, didn't have a bad word to say about anybody. You never, in all the research I did, I never one person kind of had a little bit of a problem with him was Jim Denny, who was a Opry guy who had a bad record at one point. Ernest Tubb wanted to shoot him because he was such a problem. But other than that, that's it. Nobody disliked String Bean and Estelle Aitman, and she was with him all the time. And I think that made it even worse because the Browns were so ugly, and the Aikmans really were just so innocent. They lived in a they were not they lived in a tiny house. I mean, this house is so small, and I've been inside it. It's a tiny little house. It was just the two of them. They lived so simply. They were not ostentatious. They had the Cadillac, but it was really just a joke, And they were so quiet. They didn't get in trouble, they were not tabloid people at all. They were just decent, everyday folks. And for them to be murdered, it was horrible.
Well, the man's name is Taylor Hagood. The author's name is Taylor Hagood, and the book is String Bean: The Life and Murder of a country legend. Taylor, I want to thank you for being on Light to Camera Author tonight.
Thank you very much. It's been a tremendous pleasure.
Thank you.